Welcome to LatinPerDiem. Today we're looking at John Calvin, Institutes, Book 2, Chapter 5, Section 10. This is the 10th in our series and the final episode on this work. Again, this is from Book 2, Knowledge of God the Redeemer. Denda eius modi notitia, non modo ad Dei cultum excitare nos debet, sed ad spem quoque futurae vitae expurgafacere et erigere. So Calvin continues. He says dende, which often is translated as next. Now in a sentence or a paragraph, a section of Ciceronian prose, we find these three words often used together: primo, dende, and denique. First, next, finally. They function almost like argument markers, as when we compose an outline using Roman numerals. The idea is very similar. Next, he says, the notitia, the knowledge of this kind, eius modi, and to find out what kind of knowledge he means by eius modi, you'll have to consult previous episodes. Knowledge of this kind, non modo, not only, sed quoque. Notitia here is our feminine singular nominative subject. It not only does one thing, it also does something else. It not only debet, should, excitare nos, rouse us up, ad Dei cultum, rouse us up to the worship of God, sed quoque, but it also should expurgafacere et erigere. It should do these two things. It should waken us up, expurgafacere, make us awake, and it should raise us up, erigere. Each of these infinitives is dependent on debet. You see, debet really has three infinitives, namely excitare, expurgafacere, and erigere. And of all of the infinitives that Calvin could have chosen, you can see there is a kind of alliteration here, x, and a. And Calvin has created quite a nice parallelism here. He has debet with excitare, and the object of excitare, of course, is nos. That knowledge, notitia, it ought to, debet, it ought to rouse us to what? Ad Dei cultum. And it also ought to expurgafacere, and then, of course, implicit with expurgafacere is nos. It's implicit there, not mentioned. It ought to wake us up to what? It ought to wake us up. Let me slide these things up. It ought to wake us up ad spem futurae vitae. It ought to arouse us or wake us up to the hope, the spem, of the future life. Notice these two infinitives and the balance that Calvin achieves. A balance somewhat interrupted by this third infinitive, erigere, which is also dependent on debet. And I suggest this is indicative of his Senecan influences when it comes to Calvin's Latin style. Thank you for joining us for this series on Calvin's Institutes, Book 2, Chapter 5. Please join us for additional episodes.